Now, with panel discussions, it kind of looks like we're all up here, kind of like the experts, which is exactly. I'm kidding. No, that's not the desire here at all. And knowing their hearts is what we want you to know. We want you to know their heart as well. But really, what this is a time for them to share and us to share together, and renew maybe our focus on missions, even rekindle desire for that. I know it's in your heart. So hopefully this will be a very encouraging time, a very family time, oriented time, and a time where you get to know some of our missionaries in a much deeper way. So that's a lot of the goals behind all of this. Yeah. In just a moment, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, because I could read their bios to you, but I would rather you hear from them, which I think you all are prepared for that because you know yourself. I hope. I didn't give them that question beforehand. I'm sorry, Sparky. You can complain. You can put in the complaints box afterwards. It's a round black bin in the back. As you see, we're already having way too much fun, and this is only the first session. So looking forward to what the Lord is going to do this week, and glad that you're able to join. Just a note, real briefly, before I have them introduce themselves. They're traveling far and wide, as you know missionaries do. So I know we're back to the point where fellowship time is more huggy and friendly and all that. At this time, they're not shaking hands yet, so you can wave to them, and please talk to them, but the physical contact, just because some of them have to get on a plane like 5 more times, it seems like, in the next month, to go where God has led them to next. So this time, Sparky, I'm going to start with you. Would you introduce yourself, tell us what you do now, but then just give a short history of why we would maybe call you a missionary or not, if that makes sense. So Sparky, if you go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Sparky Clancy, and I am currently pastor over at the First Baptist Church of Notice, which is over west of Caldwell. And the Lord has brought us back here from the ministry in the Democratic Republic of Congo. My family and I served there for 10 years. And
where is that, Sparky? We don't know.
The Democratic Republic of Congo is right in the center of Africa. So if you put your finger right in the middle of Africa, that's where we were serving. So we, after serving there, coming back because of political situation, health reasons, coming back, we found our church in Notice was searching for a pastor. They had been searching for a pastor for quite some time, and they asked me originally to be interim pastor as they continued their pastoral search. And we realized rapidly in trying to help our church find a pastor that the very ministry we were called to do in the Congo, to train up national leadership to work in the churches, was an area here, particularly in the Northwest, but we were seeing around the country, was becoming a great burden on our own churches, that we needed to be raising up more leaders here locally. And so being in the Notice Church, we're kind of doing multiple things. We're, of course, pastoring the church, but looking at the church there as an opportunity to train up leaders here. So bringing in interns, giving people opportunity to come out and get practical ministry experience, identifying people in the valley here that have a burden to serve the Lord, and helping equip them to go and serve in ministries around the world and locally. And still ministering in the Congo. Until COVID, we've been able to make 2 trips a year in and spend 3 to 4 weeks in the Congo. And we were supposed to be there for the entire month of July this year, and that trip got canceled. So Lord willing, I'm going to be going back in November, just myself, spending the month of November in the Congo. But pray about that, because COVID still has us restricted. We have to do testing beforehand, and they want us to have a negative test result within 72 hours of entering the country, but you have about 60 hours of flights and travel time. So I'm not really sure how they expect that to work. So we're working on a lot of details, but still confident that God is in control. And so be praying about the Congo, the ministry here, and definitely our heart for seeing leadership trained to serve in churches.
Thank you. Dr. McAllister. It should be on. We'll turn you up.
All right. I'm Bruce McAllister, and I'm Director of Ministry Relations with Gospel Fellowship Association Missions in Greenville, South Carolina. I've been in that role for about 1.5 years. I have served on the board and the executive board of GFA, all of that around anywhere from 14 to 20 years. And so been involved with that aspect of missions. My primary focus in my life has been training men for the ministry. I was director of ministerial training at Bob Jones University for many years and helped the previous director before that. So about 40 years with the ministerial class at BJ, somewhere like that. And then just traveling around the United States, encouraging pastors, churches, preaching in conferences and various things like that. So I'm considered, in a sense, by the tag, retiree from Bob Jones University. My wife had 38 and a half years there. I had 41 and a half. So together we had 80 years with BJU. Been a friend of your pastor, all through these years. So it's just great to be back at Fellowship and be back with your pastor and Brother Phil and just be back with you as well. Been here several times over the years. So my primary burden at this point in my life is that we have a very urgent need for laborers, both at home and abroad. So I'm just going to throw that, I'll just say that, I won't develop that, but that's where my burden is. So I work with American Church Planting. We have just started a GFA church staffing website and service. So that just launched in April, and it's become very active, both with men and candidates. It's growing, and we're thankful for that. And then I work with a colleague of mine who does church revitalization, interim pastor program, Marsh Fant and I working together, trying to do everything we can on the American good conservative fundamental church side. So good to be back here with you all.
So my connection to Dr. McAllister is he was one of my teachers and over the Preacher Boys, but the direct connection to you is he's one of the main reasons I'm here. So you can blame him, but I went to his office and said, I'm graduating and we want to go west. And he said, I know a pastor that may be looking, and he texts Pastor Jeff, and that's kind of the connection that formed there, and it's all downhill from there, right? So, Holly.
I was working in business for until about 5 years ago, when the Lord opened up an opportunity of short-term missions in South Africa, Cape Town. It's all the way at the bottom of the African continent. And I signed on with GFA, the same mission board that these two on either side of me are from, and enjoy working with them from afar and seeing them at the home office once in a while as well. But I went to Cape Town to help with church planting primarily, and the Lord has opened up multiple opportunities through that avenue with medical advocacy and teaching in the public school, as well as teaching in the Christian school there as well. And there's a camp, and working with professional women group as well. So the Lord has just opened up opportunities, and I was to be short-term for 2 years, and that went into about 3.5, and so I came back and transitioned to career missions, and that was finalized near Christmas time, and then deputation was starting right around March, and we all know what happened in March. So it's been interesting to have multiple reschedulings, but I'm very happy to be here with you all. My mom, I think you know Carol Farrell, she is here, and really loving this church and growing here and enjoying many good friendships here. And so I'm just happy to be here with you.
Thank you, Belinda.
Good afternoon. I'm Belinda Richter, and I'm delighted to be here again. It's been 6 years since I was last here. So I know everything's changed. You didn't have this building when I was here 6 years ago, and it is a wonderful place. So thankful I can be here with you. But I'm a missionary that you have supported since 2003, I believe. And that's when I went to the mission field as a career missionary. I served short term like Holly did, for about 2.5 years, and then came back and went on deputation and went back career in 2003. So I serve in Papua New Guinea. I would be considered the uttermost part of the world. And because once you get to Papua New Guinea, you start going around the world, you know, the other ways. Anyway, but I serve in the bush of Papua New Guinea with a team of missionaries, and I have a varied ministry doing ladies' Bible classes and teaching a Bible class in the government schools, doing a little bit of physical therapy, which is what my training was in, and I worked in physical therapy before I went to the mission field. And literacy training is a big focus of my ministry, and you'll see that highlighted in my video on Tuesday. But you know, I can't say that I ever imagined that I would be a bush missionary, but that's where the Lord has me, and I'm very thankful for a team that I work with that supports me in so many ways. And I'm thankful for supporting churches like you that support us in prayer and in finances to keep us there on the field. But it's good to be here, and I'm looking forward to this conference with you all.
Excellent. Thank you. We're so glad to have all 4 of you here. So in the foyer, we have a map with our missionaries around it. So we're going to start off with that simple question of what is a missionary? Obviously, a missionary is someone who has a postcard that's on a wall somewhere. That's what a missionary is. No, that's what we think about it, and that's even what it looks like here, because we have the missionaries here, right, and the church folk here. But really what we want to get at the heart of this is, what is a missionary? So I'm going to throw it to the panel to answer that question. How would you define a missionary?
I'll start.
Go for it, Belinda.
Okay. Well, I would say a missionary is just an ordinary person like you all sitting out there. We are not, you know, some holy person that God has especially anointed, but we have been called by the Lord to go and to fulfill the Great Commission, which Christ gave to his apostles, to go and preach the gospel and make disciples and baptize them. And so we are in a different part of the world giving the gospel to needy folks, but you know, as I have come back and experienced furlough after furlough, I have seen how America has changed. And it's very different from what it was 20 years ago when I first went to the field. And, you know, America is a mission field right now. And we all have to be ready and willing and bold and compassionate in sharing with the many, many needy folks around us, wherever we are.
Holly, what is a missionary?
Can I say why I'm a missionary?
Yeah, that ties right in and what we're going towards.
Okay.
I'll let you jump ahead or
Thank
behind.
you for letting me jump ahead. Why I'm a missionary, it's the best job on earth I can possibly think of. And I really see it as such a privilege to spend all of my time with the Great Commission and developing relationships for the purpose of seeing someone come to understand their need of Christ and to submit to Him. And there's really no greater privilege. And I know as I was in business, I struggled. I loved missions. I was definitely as involved as I could be. I did know that what I was doing then was exactly my mission field as well. So it's not anything lesser to be not a full-time missionary. In fact, the Lord really used Colossians to settle my spirit about that my mission field was wherever I was, that everything as I was doing was as unto Him. It just so happens that 5 years ago, it made the opportunity for South Africa was open, and very evidently what the Lord wanted me to do with my life at this juncture. So I just encourage all of us are missionaries wherever we are.
Bruce.
To me, missionary has a word in it that says, what? The smaller word is mission. So it's someone who is on mission, which all believers are to be involved in evangelism and discipleship and the general work of the ministry, exercising your spiritual gift, whatever that may be. There are a lot of spiritual gifts noted in the New Testament. And we're all under a command from the Lord to get the gospel to every creature and to go worldwide and geographically worldwide. And so that's an amazing command, and you go back 2,000 years and think about how challenging that would have been if you were hearing that for the first time when the Lord gave that command. Christian missions over the centuries has developed to where, and culture has developed to where, like, these ladies can get on a plane and be in Papua New Guinea in, what is it, like 24 hours? Or, yes. Or South Africa, probably short 16 or something like that, 12, about the same, with layovers probably through Europe. So it's an interesting day in which we live, that you can be virtually anywhere in the world in something like 24 to 30 hours if there is a large enough runway there to land a plane. And that's an amazing thing. Or that you can text around the world and have a reply in a minute, perhaps in a matter of seconds even. So we live in a phenomenal day with enormous resources, while for the average person to fly that far and just do that casually, most of us don't have that kind of money sitting around just for casual travel. But when you think about God's people getting behind someone and helping with that transportation and helping provide the living that they need to survive in that kind of culture, it's really amazing how much can be done. And so in my mind, not only is it true that we are a missionary wherever we go, but some people, like these ladies and Brother Sparky, when he was in Congo and when he goes back, that it's a cross-culture. Usually it implies something cross-cultural, the way we think about it. And so it's actually the very same work that people are doing at Fellowship Baptist Church. Oftentimes there's a language barrier, there are cultural things to overcome, there's all of that. I'm not belittling that. That's very, very challenging. But it's actually the same Bible, the same basic biblical teaching. Local churches are formed. They're going to look different, they're going to sound different, they're going to feel different, but it's essentially the same. So I've gotten to travel internationally quite a bit over the years and to see God's work going forward. And I can actually come as an American. I'm kind of aware that I don't know their culture usually, not very well, but I can actually teach the Bible, and I'm careful in certain things I'll say or apply, but they can actually translate it to their culture without a great deal of difficulty and sort through and go, that was an Americanism, if they know what that means. And so it's really neat how actually, what is the right word, above culture, the gospel and the work of the ministry is, so that it can be transferred. And then those places become sending centers. If it goes well, those new churches internationally planted will be sending centers, and they will probably, in a sense, reach their own people perhaps better than foreign people can do. And that's what you're after, actually. You want it to be indigenized. You want it to be nationalized. So while I'm kind of a missionary, I guess, to the American church, though I don't usually use that word, I have missionary support, that kind of thing. We just have great privileges as Americans to be able to do what these all are doing, to get the gospel to the ends of the earth. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you something in general. I might be off in this a little bit, but the further I go in ministry and life and so forth, meeting people, is that God actually has his people everywhere. And when you travel, you discover, and I can explain more about that if you want me to another time. Sparky?
Let's tie in the question that Holly already brought in, but why be a missionary? Why are you a missionary? And how did you get to that point, even full-time? Because I know the ladies have mentioned as well that either business world or doing things even before, or you didn't even train for missions necessarily. So why be a missionary, and why are you a missionary? Sparky.
That's a long answer, so I'll try to be brief. But to make a long story short, I grew up in this area. In fact, my dad and mom farmed over on Middleton Road and Highway 2026, which is soon going to be Subdivision Central. But once upon a time, there were fields out there, and so growing up in this area, my family wasn't from a believing home. And so as I knew Christ as a child through an Awana ministry in a church in Nampa, I was intrigued then after I received Christ. Well, why doesn't everybody know Christ? Why doesn't everybody hear about Christ? And always as a young person intrigued by missionaries, and going into junior high and high school, just saying, you know, God, if you would use me, I'm ready to go. I'll go wherever you want, only on my terms. And that was a big stumbling block for me. You know, I had it all figured out. Well, if I go get a teaching degree, I can go overseas and I can teach. Everybody wants a teacher, you know, and then I'll live on a compound. I won't have to be out in the jungles of Africa and, you know, trying to survive off of grubs or anything like that. And so, you know, I had in my mind what I was willing to do for the Lord, and amazingly, he didn't work the way that I thought he would. And I ended up farming in Idaho again, and I just, you know, helping with the ministry out at Notice, working with the youth, learning to preach and be available for other churches that were without a pastor or pastor was on vacation. And finally, just breaking and saying, Lord, if you want us to stay in Idaho and serve, we're willing to serve. And it was at that time then that God began to open the doors and presented the Congo ministry to us. And so why be a missionary? Because there are people all over the world who are going to hell because they haven't heard the gospel. And who's willing to go? Who's going to go and tell them? And as we got to Congo, which, by the way, is a country that in any statistic is going to come out now 85 to 90% Christian in any polls, when we got there, we found out the people don't believe the Bible. They haven't been trained the Bible. And the Jesus that they believe in is a Jesus of false doctrines. And so all of a sudden, these Christians are completely ignorant of Scripture. Who's going to teach them? Who's going to finish up the Great Commission of teaching them all things whatsoever I have written unto you? And who's going to do that? And so why be a missionary? Because people are lost, and people are being lied to, and they're being deceived. And without somebody to teach the Word of God, they will stay that way.
So even in America, do you feel there's a different culture even in your neighbors? And do you feel people are being lied to, even your neighbors? Just a thought. Any other thoughts on that? Ladies, I'd like to hear from you, especially transferring out of maybe business world into missions, and what's that like, and maybe how that happened or why that happened.
Something that came to mind as Sparky was speaking was while I was a student at Bob Jones, oftentimes Dr. Bob would have us repeat in chapel. I kept wanting to call it choir, and I knew it wasn't choir. In chapel each day, that the most sobering reality in the world today is that people are dying and going to hell today. And that really sunk deep, I know, in my heart, just as a reminder that what is our principal goal as believers to the world. As far as coming out of business into missions, boy, you know, it is a long story as well. But I can say this, that early on when I wanted to be in ministry and wasn't, and the Lord really worked in my heart to know that what I was doing was exactly what He wanted me to, then I really surrendered to Him with that, and we kind of had a private pact that if He would have me in full-time missions, that He would make it very evidently clear, and that what timing was right. So my own personal position there was I didn't want to try to be knocking down that door if that's not what the Lord would have. And I know that there are times when you need to knock down a door, but for me it wasn't. And so when it was time, I felt like I was just hanging on the shirt tails trying to keep up. And really, within a matter of months, I was from the business world to the field. It was a matter of, 7 months from the time I signed on with GFA and transitioning out, having someone to replace me and training them, and being fully supported to the mission field in 7 months. And to me, that's unusual, and it wasn't anything that I did, and I knew that that was just one evidence that the Lord will provide and will do things, and sometimes very quickly if and when he needs to.
Belinda, any thoughts as well?
I was working full-time as a physical therapist and, happy in my work and not really, I was open to missions. Every time I saw a missions presentation at my church in Greenville, I thought, oh, I could go there. But the Lord hadn't called me, hadn't directed me. And I even went on a short-term mission trip with the Bob Jones team in '93, fully expecting that God was going to call, write it in the sky, go to Kenya. And it didn't happen, so I just kept plodding along, working on my graduate classes one at a time and working full-time as a physical therapist. And it was just in an ordinary Wednesday night prayer service that I really was prompted by the Holy Spirit to go help this family that was new to the field in Papua New Guinea. And so that was the beginning of calling me out of my career as a physical therapist, which was very hard for my family. They thought, why are you leaving such a good job to go to the end of the earth? My family is still Catholic and unsaved, and so that was a very strange thing for them. But I knew it was the Lord's doing, and he had me wait 1.5 years in order to go to Papua New Guinea because it took that long to get the necessary government paperwork done. And so that was a real hard time, but I didn't give up, and although I was discouraged, but the Lord did get me there in his timing and allowed me to keep working full time to pay the bills. So just God's ways are always best, and just thankful for his clear leading along the way.
Dr. McAllister, I'm going to ask you to start with this one. What does it take for a full-time missionary to get to the field? Obviously, you've had a lot of experience working with those missionaries. What are some of the hindrances? What does the finances look like for maybe a typical missionary? Can you just walk us through some of that?
So I'm going to just kind of knock this out, I hope, pretty quickly. Naturally, there needs to be a clear sense of calling from God and direction, and that takes a little time to work through. If a person were sensing God is doing a work in their heart in that direction, it would be wise to talk, first of all, at least to the local pastor, and then perhaps some known missionaries or good Christian advisors. Occasionally, churches have the wherewithal where they actually like to be the sending agency for a missionary, but I would say most of the time, most churches are not set up to take care of all the complexities of an American citizen going to another country and living there and having the full support network. Some churches may be able to do that. Most missionaries that I know of go through a missions agency. And so that is a process. Like Holly went through an application process with GFA. She was already serving in South Africa with some GFA missionaries, and known to us, so it's not like a stranger walking in, but there's a detailed application. They meet with a committee who interviews them. That committee, in our case with GFA, makes a recommendation to the executive committee, who almost always signs off on whatever the interviewing committee does. The director of the mission, another director of the mission get involved in this process pretty deep. Dr. Mark Vittori is our executive director. Dr. Alan Patterson is our veteran director, I would say, like regional director, but He and Mark are the two veteran men, so they really carry the load there. And so then they are, like in Holly's case or Belinda's case, they were eventually approved, and then they begin deputation, which is a long process for some people of contacting churches, setting up meetings, going to conferences like this, and speaking and letting the need be known, and then the church makes a decision about whether or not to support that missionary. That process can go, if it goes well, it would be incredibly well to be out for a year in deputation and on your way. 2 years would be really good. 3 years, sometimes it takes 3 years for some. Occasionally it takes 4 for people to raise support. You say, well, how much support do they raise? They have to live at a it's complicated, but in some European countries, the amount needed because of rent and expenses, it may cost twice as much in some European cities and countries as it does in America. So that's going to raise that amount considerably. It might be more than you make, but it's much more expensive than how you and I have to live here in this part of the country. So then the mission agency helps to set that target, and so then they're just, every missionary is human. Every missionary has all the potential challenges that everyone else has. They have family, they have sometimes sick parents they have to get back and take care of because there's no other siblings to take care of them. They have children that have medical needs. They have all those complexities, and so a mission agency helps them with those complexities. And yet, at the same time, missionaries still have to take charge of their own lives, in a sense, and family. So then there's the coming back from 3 years out, maybe 3 or 4 years out, coming back for 6 months to 12 months on furlough, connecting back with churches, getting ready to go again. And it's fairly complex. So GFA has a fairly large missionary family. So what we're doing as directors is and others primarily more so than me, are working with those details all the time. So we have about 12 or 15 full-time, part-time staff in our office to facilitate all that's involved, and especially the financial support part of that. Our finance team is a pretty, it takes a number of people to process, because everything comes in, most of the time, a little bit at a time. So all of those gifts come in, have to be properly receipted, good, strong accounting in the right accounts, and transferred money internationally. So it's a big deal on the financial side.
Yeah. So there's a lot that goes into it, is what you're saying. Kind of a little bit off of that one, what struggles or hardships do missionaries face, or what even hardships have you faced as a missionary, and how maybe signs of God's grace in overcoming that? Sparky, I'm going to throw this one to you starting off, but what are the hardships in this?
Well, I think one of the first thing that everybody hits is, what did I get myself into? Is this really what God had for me? Because whether we want to acknowledge it or not, we have expectations. When we get to the field, we have in our idea that we're just starting with a blank sheet. Like, these people don't know anything, so we're just going to start this ministry, and we kind of get to set the tone and the direction. And you find out that the people you're working with have expectations. And so there's a collision of what I thought I was going to do, what the people thought I was going to do. And Mindy and I, as we had those first months and the first even years in the Congo, we had to really wrestle with a lot of these questions that you guys have asked on this panel. What is a missionary? What are we here to do? What is it that we actually are hoping to see accomplished? And are these other things important? And what's not important? And ultimately, as we look at missions as a whole, I think sometimes we look at missions as, well, what can we spare? What are the things that are spared that we can put into this ministry or we can put into this program? And wrestling with missions, really, both from here as churches sending and as missionaries on the field serving, it's more of, what can I sacrifice? What do I need to give of myself? What do I need to let go of? Whether it's my expectations, whether it's my dream, whether it's my, my things that were important to me, like being able to watch the football game every Sunday or whatever. What am I going to sacrifice and be willing to let go of so that the mission, which we've identified is reaching people with the gospel of Christ and training up local churches, what are we going to sacrifice to make that happen? And there's a little bit of, but I don't want to let go of that. My culture is important to me, and I don't want to let go of things. And so, what were we willing to let go of, and what expectations were we willing to put aside to let God lead the ministry and show us what He wanted to accomplish? And so that was a big struggle for us.
Yeah. Anyone else on just the struggles of a missionary, even your own personal struggles, and how God has worked in your heart and shown His grace?
Well, I think one of the biggest struggles I still face, even after being in PNG almost 20 years, is just the whole cultural mindset of the PNG people, and trying to understand that still. I mean, I don't feel that I understand it, and I just have to constantly rethink how to approach things and quit, thinking American, and that's it's just a constant battle, living in another culture and trying to adapt to that, and trying to show Christ to them without the American side, I guess, of myself. So.
Let's shift the focus a little to even churches here. What do you think the state of missions is today? And if you could say something to the American church about missions, what would that be? So what do you feel the state of missions is in the American church today, even you're supporting churches, and what would you want to communicate to us about that? Holly, do you have a thought? I'm going to start with you.
Can read my mind, sorry. Even before I pick up my microphone. Well, I know my experience on the field for the 3.5 years, watching 3 seasoned missionary couples retire and wondering who will replace them, because there are no replacements yet. And also working with a couple who's likely in their last decade, just seeing that there is a great need for laborers, like Dr. McAllister said.
Dr. McAllister, do you have any on that same idea?
Well, there is what has happened in the 20th century, from an American perspective, is exceeding abundantly above all we could ask or think, in a sense. Not like patting ourselves on the back. Well, when you think about the condition of the American Protestant church 100 years ago, liberalism had taken over the seminaries, influenced by liberal German theologians, that had made its way downstream, and the American, heretofore, 100 years ago, Bible-believing denominations basically were lost to liberalism. So out of that came the independent, fundamental, conservative, sometimes called evangelical, church movement, and new Bible colleges and seminaries, and eventually in the 60s and 70s and 80s, Christian schools were formed. Thousands of Christian schools, thousands and thousands of American churches were planted. New fellowship groups of churches were formed. And thousands and thousands and thousands of missionaries went internationally. Mm-hmm. There has been a whole lot of good accomplished for the Lord's sake, for the gospel's sake, historically in this past several generations. Not like we arrived, not like we did all that we should have done, but a lot has happened. And some of those fields have become really strong sending fields, like, for example, the Philippines. And by the way, God doesn't need America to do all the missions in the world. I've had the privilege to teach Chinese pastors, underground church pastors, on 4 occasions. And there is a whole lot going on in China in spite of all the persecution. It needs maturity, it needs growth, it needs doctrinal soundness, but still, there's a lot going on, and I could talk about that more in depth. So I think we need to stay positive and thankful about what God has done. And when I drove in the parking lot at Fellowship Baptist Church this afternoon, I started snapping pictures, okay? And I know the building's not the church, but I was still taking pictures of the church building, all right, because of what God has done here. And, you know, you're here, and it's normal to you, but you actually, in my judgment, are in one of the finest church plants in all the western United States. And I've been around the barn enough to know this is really a neat one. So what you're doing and what God has done here and what you're doing to help international missions is very important. But, that's my positive side, all right? But there has been a significant downturn in recent years. It's kind of a 10 to 20 year trend. I've watched the stats personally up front close. I was actually the statistician for these things, okay, in our context at BJ. And something started happening, and it wasn't just BJ. The evangelical world broadly is concerned about this. A Barna study. I'm going to probably say more about this another occasion. So there is a need now. There's a serious need and shortage of laborers, both at home and abroad. And so everyday folks like us need to pray toward that end. Lord of harvest, send forth laborers. And I think we need to get personal about it in our families, in our children, and ourselves, where we say, Lord, what would you have me to do? You know, megatrends are one thing, but it's like you can only really do something about you, ultimately, right? Mm-hmm. So, and then, of course, pray to the Lord that He'll do a lot. So, and when I see what God did in the 20th century, and what He's doing in the early years of the 21st century, I know that God can do it again. And He might not choose to do it primarily through America, but we'd sure love to be in on it. And so I think we need to be, that verse I quoted, Ephesians 3:20, 21, that God is able to do more than we can ever imagine. Unto Him who is able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we can ask or think, unto Him be glory in the church throughout all ages, world without end. Mm-hmm. So God can do it, and we just need to look to Him and be really sold out to whatever it is God would have us to do personally. I got a little preachy there, okay, but I'll do more tomorrow.
We'll let him do more of that later this week, too. Sparky, can you also hone in on individual response, too, from the church, from us? How can we get involved in helping missions today, too, tied in with all of this that we're talking about?
Absolutely. Just thank you, Brother McAllister. Exactly what he just shared with you is the state of missions today. We are seeing that the laborers are not there. Missionaries are retiring. Pastors are retiring. There's nobody stepping up to replace them. And so our role as churches and our role now as missionaries on the field is we need to now be working on replicating ourselves. And as Brother McAllister shared, it might not be the Americans that are going to continue to go out. And one of the things that we realized very quickly in the Congo is that we probably won't have anybody to follow up our ministry. We are weird. We're out living in the middle of the jungles with no power, no water, and, who's going to come out and continue this after we're gone? Or what if we have to leave because of politics or health, which is what ended up happening. And so challenging the Congolese people and training them to replicate themselves, to go deeper into the jungle, to go further into those dark areas where the gospel has not been preached or the false teachers have deceived entire villages, they now have received that mantle. And we've trained them to go and reach those people that we will never personally visit. And I think we're seeing that happen on a global scale. We're seeing more and more responsibility, and our role as local churches are training others how to replicate themselves. And as a local church here, we need to help them with that. We need to be preparing resources, taking trips over and teaching them, how did a church plant happen right here in Nampa, Idaho? What about a church in Nevada that would love to see the same thing happen there? And training them how you did what you did and how God worked in that, and helping them to reproduce what happened here. And that can happen in China, that can happen in Korea, that can happen anywhere in the world. And so we're seeing through missions a real change from us being the front runners and the pioneers into new areas to the equippers, and we're becoming an equipping force to help those young churches and those national churches now go out and reach those areas that we haven't gotten to.
Greg, I'm going to ask you to stand up and ask your question right there, and then I'll repeat it for the live stream.
Sparky pretty much just answered it.
Okay.
But I was wondering, we've been in missions a good 50-plus years, multiple missionaries and fields. And I know just like every church plant is different between Nevada and here, and every mission field is different, and even the missions on the same field are different. I was wondering if they might be able to address the indigenous folks, the citizens of their own countries, ministering to and reaching out to other areas, going out from, say, their hometown, going over to another area of the country or even outside the country. Do they see people stepping up to do that on their fields?
So that's great. That's next on our list. And the idea is, let's talk about church planting, if you want to, as it relates to mission. All of you have been you've all been very closely involved in church planting or planted churches, and all of this. So both stateside and on the mission field, what is it like to be part of a church plant, and what does it look like? What are those churches then also doing, and tying in with Greg's question? Belinda, you look like you're ready to go.
Well, I was just going to speak what's going on in Papua New Guinea, because it has been very encouraging in the last couple of months. The Bourbons, who I work under, started in 1997, so they're 20 plus years, and just this year we've seen more of the national believers get a burden for missions. And actually the assistant pastor, the assistant PNG pastor, took a group of 4 other men with him, and they trekked out into the jungles, literally, for about 9 days. And it was just a real eye-opening experience for them. They just left with a backpack that had some crackers in it and some tracks, and they didn't, they had no way of arranging anything. They would just trek to a village, and the village had to take care of them through God answering prayer, and that's what happened. And they were able to give the gospel and pass out tracts to many, many unreached villages. And these men now have a greater burden for missions and want to go back, and so we're thankful for that. And then our church, too, after just being 2 little small church plants, we've been able to start trekking about 4 hours into another village every other weekend, because there's a small group of believers that have formed there. So we're grateful to see what is happening. But yeah, it has been a slow work. You've been there 20 plus years. You think it would have happened faster, but the Lord is accomplishing His work and growing His kingdom.
Holly, can you speak to your experience just as far as church planting, and how's that worked in the mission field and even spread?
Yes, we did plant a church while I was there within about 6 months of arriving. And while our church is still very young, we are working with other churches that are a first-generation church plant. And some of the young adults from there, I've been very excited to see their burden. Their parents are have just taken over as a national pastor from a missionary planted church. So their parents are a first-generation national pastor, and they have a heart for missions. So to me, that's very exciting that it's not taking 5 generations before there's a zeal there, but rather right away. And could I mention, there was a church that I was just very excited about. I visited with a missions conference back in June, and it really stuck with me that it was a church that had some trouble, and the pastor came in, but he didn't come by himself. His whole family moved back to the area with him to help him. And I was just so encouraged by that. Even children that are outside the home and married, they all decided to move back and help him with that church. And it's a vibrant church, small but vibrant. And I thought, how many families might be able to do that with one another and really work together as a team to go out and establish these ministries and strengthen ones that may have come under attack?
If I could just illustrate, I think this is what you're after. If it's not, you changed my direction here. I've had the privilege to go and usually spend a week helping to train pastors. Sometimes it involves their wives or various ladies that are called co-workers, and the Chinese, I understand, generally call themselves co-workers rather than pastors. It's just their way of speaking, I guess. But like I mentioned, I've done 4 weeks of training with them, and one time in China, 3 times on an offshore location that I probably shouldn't identify, but folks that can get into China, go recruit pastors. They will come out, spend maybe 6 months, 3 months, 12 months in training. It's very sacrificial for them to do that. But it helps them to get grounded in sound doctrine and sound ministry thinking. And I remember teaching a group of, and we were toward the end of the week of teaching, and I was talking about church planting, not in a huge way. I taught church planting at Bob Jones for 25 years. I think I probably taught 1,000 young men how to plant churches. I would have never dreamed that the Lord would give me that privilege when I was a struggling little church planter up in North Carolina, weekends, doing that. But out of all this, I was talking to these young, and some of them were young, some of them were not young, Chinese pastors, co-workers. I said to them, are there enough churches in China for the people, for the population? Because, American thinks, no, there's no way. And they were rather sheepish, and they didn't want to answer my question. I couldn't figure it out, and I still probably don't exactly understand the way they acted about that question. They might have been afraid there was an informant in their group, someone from the Communist Party. But when they finally answered it, they went, you see, in China, I think at the time at least, your church you couldn't get more than 30 people together. It may be a little larger than that today. Of course, there's a lot of crackdown right now. But actually, keeping it small means it's got to keep growing. It's like persecution causes the growth of churches. You have to keep new cell churches going. Now, is it really covering the whole population? I don't know that it really is in reality, but there are lots of churches. And one of the best things you can do in missions today, like Sparky was saying, is to equip the nationals to do it. I was in India within the last 2-3 years in Manipur State. There was a missionary went in 100 years ago named William Pettigrew. He went into headhunter territory, and he started evangelizing. This is the far, far northeastern edge of India next to Myanmar. And they started planting Baptist churches. I think he was from Judson's influence, okay? And so here it is. So here I am now going in 100 years later, and there's a nice group of young pastors who are planting churches, and they told me this in Manipur State. Now, this is not all of India, but in that part of the country, there'll be one church per community, and it will be a Baptist church. Now, it's American Baptist, which in America is liberal. But they're trying to carve out a fundamental, strong, conservative, Bible-believing element among those churches. And I had the privilege on a Sunday morning. By the way, in India, they have their morning church services are at 6 o'clock in the morning or 7 o'clock in the morning. So here I am preaching at 7 a.m. on Sunday morning. But
And you still preach till 12:30, right?
Yeah, it was. But here's a lot. I mean, it was a room probably twice as big as this room, full of colorfully dressed Indian people. And what I was doing is I was just enjoying the fruit of labors that had gone on 100 years before. And I have two roommates, Mike Ring in Porto Alegre, Brazil, way down in the south of Brazil. He's been down there for a lifetime now, planting churches. At one time they had a little Bible school that I taught in for a week, and they were doing this multiplication through training national pastors. Have another roommate, Ron from college, Ron Cochran, who's in Hermosillo, Mexico, taught there a few years ago, and they have planted churches out from their church, and they have a Bible Institute there as well that's pretty well known in that part of the world. And so what I'm saying is that church planting and the planting of a number of churches and then getting workers from those churches to eventually pastor those churches and plant more churches, that's where the real growth, in my opinion, takes place. But it did take, initially, American missionaries willing to go, willing to sacrifice, go cross-cultural. And actually, in Ron's case, Ron Cochran, and Mike Ring's case, I think all of their kids love the ministry. And if they're not all in the ministry, many of them are in the ministry. And some of them are back in Brazil, and some of them are in Central America from the Cochran's family. And so, to me, that's what's really exciting. And I've lived long enough, and these guys were my roommates, so it's been a privilege to go where they are. So anyway,
Right.
that's what I see as exciting about it.
Sparky, can you also, if you have more to say on that, that's great. But then also, I'd like to hear from you what is just a simple model of church planting that works no matter where you are. Does
Sure.
that make sense? Just
Yep.
to give it to it simple.
And then I'm going to rant just a little.
Go rant.
Okay. Simple model. Church planting involves 4 steps, and any church plant model that follows these 4 steps will work in any culture. First, you have to reach people with the gospel of Christ. That's where it begins. And I read an interesting book called The Essential of Christian Missions, and on evangelism, I really appreciated, and it really helped me in my philosophy and doctrine of missions. He stated that evangelism is not the end of missions, it's the beginning. When people get saved, the mission process has just begun. And so now you take these saved people, and phase 2 then is teaching them the Word of God, teaching them to walk with Christ. The catchphrase today is discipleship, that we mentor them in the Scriptures and teach them what it means to live faith. And so the discipleship then is going to rise out of that. We're going to see those that God has called and equipping to be leaders. And so we need a leadership development in place. When we see these ones stepping up that could be deacons, that could be pastors, that could be evangelists, are we just saying, okay, well, here's a nice little book to read on that, good luck, and we'll see you in 20 years and see how it went? Or are we going to develop them and equip them and train them to do that? And the 4th step then is teaching them then how to multiply. When churches, as Brother McAllister just said, when churches are now planting churches, then the cycle of missions is complete. And the role of the missionary is move on, as the Apostle Paul did, and let's go do that somewhere else, and just turn them over and let them go and keep that relationship. That's where fellowship, networking, associations, whatever you want to call it, come into play, where we're keeping those churches connected with one another and connected with us. But now we're more of a co-laborer role, and we're just there to help them through the struggles and things that they're going on. which leads to my rant a little bit. I think one of the things that we're learning now in missions is the importance of national sustainability. And if we're going to start something, it needs to be something that they can take over and sustain long after we have left. That hit Mindy and I on a trip that we made out deep into the jungles of Africa. We had heard there were old churches that were started and planted back in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, before the rebellion, before the Belgian Congo fell into Zaire, became a dictatorship, and many of those missionaries were forced to leave in the 50s and 60s. And we heard about these old churches out there, and we visited them, and we found them. We found churches that were 50, 60 years old, and what we found there was believers that were 60, 70, and 80 years old. No new believers. It was the same ones that had gotten saved all those years ago. And so we asked them, well, why are you not sharing your faith? Why are you not reaching people with the gospel? Well, we don't have gospel tracts. Well, we don't have the Jesus film. We don't have the things that the missionaries came and used to reach us, and because we don't have those things, we don't know how to reach people with the gospel of Christ. And I felt like kind of a fool because I had a backpack full of a projector and tracts, and I'm like, well, I could give this to them, but what's going to happen when those break or when I can't come back with more? And so, you know, our mission model of evangelism in the Congo literally came down to, if you have a stick and some dirt, we will teach you how to share your faith with somebody drawing with a stick in the dirt and walking them through a gospel presentation. And all of a sudden, as we began to teach them how to share their faith in the dirt, we started seeing the churches growing and exploding and multiplying and asking now, well, we need pastors, we need training. And it was almost overwhelming. We thought, what did we do? We opened up this can of worms. We can't handle all of this. But they were paralyzed because they were not given a model that was sustainable for them. And so I think one of the things that we're learning in missiology now is when we're working with nationals, we need to start out with a sustainable model.
Amen. Good. Yeah. And Dr. McAllister will speak more to us on Monday and Tuesday about church planting specifically. So he can save his rant his sermon for that. How do we personally get involved? I'm kind of going back to that question, but things like, you know, short-term mission trips, ladies, you've been involved in that. We've talked about our own responsibility to disciple, to evangelize. How can we individually be involved in both church planting and missions? Is there also a connection between church planting here locally and worldwide missions? What's the connection there? Is that needed? You know, you have to have a strong home base to send people out, or what does it take for that? I know that's a multifaceted question there, but
let me just, and I'll try not to dominate here. When our children were small, I mean really small, like we have 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls. The first baby was a little boy. He was 7 weeks old, and my wife and I felt led of the Lord to plant a church 60 miles from Greenville in Forest City, North Carolina. And it was a real step of faith. And the scariest day of my life was going with Dr. Otis Holmes up to that town and trying to scout it out and determine if maybe the Lord would have us plant a church there. But we went. We did. Just didn't know exactly what we were doing, but we did it. And another little boy came along during that time. And the church was established, and we built a building. They called their first full-time pastor, and it went really well. I thought it was slow at the time, but it went, in 4 years, building was built, and they called full-time pastor, and praise the Lord, okay? Still going today. They've sent out lots of missionaries from that church over the years. Mm-hmm. It's near Ambassador Baptist College up near Shelby, North Carolina. So we were there before Ambassador, but it's had a connection somewhat over the years. So, And then I pastored another church. This was a rescue attempt. Long story there. But then another child came along, a little girl. And then eventually another little girl came along in our family. And then we helped plant a church in Spartanburg County back from 1994 to 2001 with a pastor friend of mine who had come back from the mission field, Pastor Eric Sipe. And it really went well under Pastor Sipe's leadership. It was really good. Great experience for our family. What I'm saying here is consider getting your family directly involved in church planting. one of the most satisfying things to me is that as now, I'm 65 now, is that all of our adult children have helped to plant churches as adults, as young adults, separate from our involvement. And New York City, Washington, D.C., Nashville, Salt Lake, wherever, it's just, and it's not always my flavor, exactly, but it's gospel preaching ministries. And that is one of the most satisfying things in life. And you kind of course, my parents helped plant a church when I was a little boy. The church I was saved in was a church plant, Faith Baptist in Decatur, Alabama. So it's like this thing keeps going. But if all you know about church is just the routine of going to established churches, stop and think. This church was planted. Any church you've ever been in was scratching it out, starting somewhere. And if you've ever been a part of a start and it's gone well, it's really thrilling, and especially in retrospect. And it makes all the hard times seem like that's okay. We forget all that. It's like raising your family. Comes out well. It's like, okay, we're not worried about the hard times. We're just thankful to God for what He's done.
So getting involved, ladies, I'd like to throw this part of that question to you about short-term missions trips, and how does that play a role even in our church to get people excited about missions, or what does that look like? Is that a good thing? You went on short-term mission trips. Did that change your mind about foreign missions as well?
Dr. McAllister mentioned about being involved as a family and having your children involved, and I really think that's where the Lord planted it in my heart about ministry and missions and church planting. Was in 7th grade. I was part of starting a church with my family, and just to see the struggle and the like you said, the good times and the bad, and that church is still there. Do they have struggles along the way? Yes, every church does, but to see it still there after 35 years is very exciting to me, and is invigorating to know that just the Lord sustains what He builds. Short term. I went short term, I guess. I went on different trips. First with the university, I went with the Mission Team West, the first one that Dr. Bill Lovegrove led out here in '98. And boy, that was a whole summer of working out in Utah, Nevada, Wyoming, and Idaho. And again, every time I went on a team, after that, that was the one that I had been taking extra Bible classes in my undergraduate studies, but when I came back as a graduate student, I knew I needed solid, more Bible training because of having been on that team. But it stirred and continued to build a desire to be a part of ministry. And then as a business person, I would take my vacation times, and a lot of times missionaries would say, could you come and help for this short time? We have a retreat that we're doing and need extra hands for, or brainstorming or planning on the field. And so that's how I got involved short term, like short term. I should qualify that, where it was, probably less than 2 weeks or less, because that's what was available to me. And that was Cameroon and Kenya and a couple times to South Africa. And those are all very valuable. When I went short term with Gospel Fellowship Association, it was called short term. In my mind, it was, I was already career, and but it was a means to an end as far as really. I wanted to be there at least 2 years, because how do you establish relationships with folks when you're only there for a few months even? Because when you go to a field and you're there such a short time, people don't really think you're invested in them or their ministry, or can have a tendency to be that way. And but boy, after a couple of years, they're like, you're one of us, and you have much more opportunity and a depth of relationship there that then can be built on, and a trust factor. And so I know I struggle a little bit, and I guess this is my rant, with some folks. The value of short-term missions is exceeding. But if you have a career mindset, but you say, okay, I'm going to go into a place for 5 years and work with music or a particular thing, but you're not planning to stay, it usually ends up being a bit short-sighted, it seems. The folks, again, it just is not relationship building. And I'm not explaining it as well as I would like to. But having a growing where you're planted mindset, I guess, and really committing long-term is important.
Linda, do you have any thoughts on?
Well, I think, yeah, the idea of short term, whether it's for a few weeks or a few months or a few years, can be very beneficial, especially when it comes to you and your family. I know many families don't travel out of the United States. And I once heard this from an unsaved person, and it really clicked with me. She was actually teaching me how to make splints for therapy. But she said, yeah, she says, I think it should be required of every American family to leave the comfort of a first world and go to a third world country with their children. So because it had changed her kids' whole perspective on things, because they got to see how blessed and well off they were, and how a great majority of the rest of the world lives. And so there's that aspect where you know, short-term missions can just be so beneficial in opening the eyes of your children that you may not really understand until, you know, they're older. But it is a very good first exposure. I was sitting here thinking about this one question, just the planting of the healthy churches in the USA and international missions, and what is their connection? It's huge. I mean, I wouldn't be on the field without the healthy churches God so graciously gave me in 2002 and 2003 when I went on deputation. I was just sitting here thinking through the churches. You know, you're one of them. You're very young. You're less than 20 years old, right?
17.
Yeah, 17,
18,
yeah. And I was just in a church that celebrated their 25th anniversary. I was just in another church that had just celebrated their 19th anniversary. So they're very young in the Lord, but they started supporting missionaries when they were from the get-go. You know, but yet I have several churches that support me that were established by BJ grads, you know, that went out en masse back in the 50s and the 60s. And, you know, so those churches are more like 70 years old, but they're still going for the Lord because they were healthy, planted churches and well-rounded churches that includes missions in their health plan, I guess you could say.
I come from a very middle-class background. Neither of my parents are college grads. My dad worked for Goodyear Service Stores for 35 years. My mom, when we were a little older, she worked for Sears for 25, 30, 35 years. So I don't come from a background that I never flew on a plane until my senior year of college, and that was an unusual situation. I flew in a Goodyear blimp over Miami one time when I was a little boy. My dad worked that out. But if you're not used to thinking about getting on an airplane or going somewhere unfamiliar, and if here would be my thinking. Like one time I had a pastor friend. He used to say to me, "You've got to get to the mission field. You've got to get to the mission field." And it bugged me because I was a struggling middle-class Christian college teacher, administrative assistant. It was all I could do to pay my bills and take care of my 4 kids. And here's a pastor that maybe he has a missions budget that can launch him somewhere, but I said, Mark, it's not Mark Minnick, it's another Mark. I said, I don't have any money to do that. But that Pastor Mark made arrangements, and he had someone that had means through a financial settlement of an injury, and they liked to send people to the mission field. And this lady sent my wife and me to Poland. That was the first time I ever really went anywhere out of the country. And I taught some pastors there for a week, some young men in college rather. And it opened the world up. Now here's my point: is not just travel. It's not just travel, but it's that if you will pray to the Lord, God owns everything. He owns everything. And if He wants you and me to do something, if that means go cross-cultural somewhere, take care of an expensive flight arrangement, or plant a church, if we will have faith in God and ask God. I did this with my wife and me. There was a point, it's been about 10 years ago. I've only prayed like this probably 3 times in my life. I had in my heart that I wanted to go to Israel, and I had no idea how I would do it financially. I got down on my knees in our bedroom, and I prayed a prayer like this. I said, "Now, God, I've been reading this book all these years. Now, I want to go see this." It was about as straight up a prayer as I've ever prayed. A few days later, then a week or two, I had a friend of mine who's dean of the seminary at BJ. He sent out an email. He said, "We've got 39 people going to Israel. If we get one more, we're at 40, and we get a free person when we get to 40. And I forwarded that email to my wife, who was working at BJ at the time, and she sent me back a smiley face. And I thought, okay, got that, that's good. So I contacted my friend, and this is not a mission trip per se, but this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. And he's a very close friend of mine, and I said, "We're interested." He said, "Interest doesn't count. You have to commit." I'm like, "Hey, buddy, aren't we friends?" And, about 50 days from the time I made that prayer request, my wife and I were in Israel. Mm-hmm. So God can give you the grace and the ability and the financial backing to do whatever He wants you to do. And I would encourage you to go cross-cultural. And it may just mean go to Canada. It's not that far away.
Or California.
Yeah. Some of you have left that mission field already. But I can remember my wife is from near New York City. So that was a different world than I grew up in North Alabama. Okay? But then I got comfortable with that part of the country. So, here's what you find. My father-in-law used to say, he pastored the same church for 61 years in New Jersey. Same church, 61 years. He said, people are people wherever you go. Mm-hmm. And that's the way it is. So, all right.
So this ties in. I'm going to open the floor in just a little bit for questions, but it ties in with what Dr. McAllister was just saying, and it kind of wraps up what we have on our sheet, I think. How do you overcome fears? What are the apprehensions that any of us, all of us, could have? And we've already talked some about that, of Lord, okay, we've talked about things like evangelism, discipleship, modeling, just going and doing it, being a person of faith, I think, is all tied up in what we talked about. There's a lot of apprehension and fear in that. How do we overcome that and just do it? I don't know.
Short-term missions don't call people to missions. Local churches prepare people for missions. And I can't remember the name of the book, Mindy, that we read on short-term missions. Was it When Helping Hurts? Okay. But one of the studies that they have found over and over again is that short-term missions, like each of us that has committed to serving in a foreign field, we all have something in common. And most of us did make a short-term mission trip, and it really impacted and confirmed our burden to reach people. But you'll find a common theme in those that go overseas to serve or go to another culture to serve. They already had a burden to serve. And that burden was grown in their local church. And so, it's really exciting to say, well, let's go over to Congo and help run that VBS. But that passion to reach people for Christ through a vacation Bible school, it starts right here. And so if a church wants to cultivate missions-minded thinking, it starts right here, serving right where God has put you, being excited about what God's doing right here in Nampa. If you want to have a burden to plant churches overseas, then we need to be actively working and planting churches right here where God's put us and reaching our own valley and our own community. And the overflow of that is going to be then, as some of you travel overseas and are experiencing other cultures, that burden is just going to splurge over into that, and it's going to build excitement, and you will reach the nations with the gospel of Christ because you're reaching your own community. And so where do we get rid of the fear, Phil? We overcome that fear by doing it right here. And when you're serving Christ here, when you're boldly sharing Christ with your neighbors here, then it's not so scary to share it in Mexico or Canada or Congo or Papua New Guinea or South Africa. It's what you do. It's who you are, and you've cultivated that right here. And so, those that are serving the Lord overseas really should be the ones that were already committed to serving. And churches are sending not just those that couldn't figure out their life here, so let's send them overseas and hope they figure out their life over there. No, we're sending our best and our brightest and our most passionate for the gospel, and it's just splurging out and it's reaching other cultures. And so the best way to overcome fear is being passionate about serving right here. Teach your children how to serve right here. As a family, serve right here. And then when God gives you an opportunity to go overseas, it's like, yeah, that's the next thing. Let's do this. And those fears will subside as we trust God right where He's put us.
Anyone else? Thoughts on that? Overcoming the fear, the roadblocks, apprehensions, and getting missions done.
Well, I know I was in a position in life where I was moving to the next step, and it was like the coronavirus, the great unknown, that was tripping me up. And I had put a pause on taking the next step. And in my devotions one morning, the Lord really shined a light on the fact that it was because I was fearful of the unknown, what I didn't know. And when I submitted to the Lord in my heart about that, it was like that, that he moved forward. And it won't be that way for everyone, but in my experience, that's what happened with me. And 9 months later, I was on the mission field. So.
All right, I want to give you an opportunity to ask questions. We'll have a few minutes of that. I know, Bert, you'll be up first, but others, if we could have them quickly. I need to repeat them for live stream, and those on live stream, if you want to type them in the YouTube comments, if there's other questions. Bert, go ahead, please. So, repeating the question. Thank you, Sparky. We are a church that does support missions, but that we have a lot of new visitors and new people coming in from different backgrounds. So what do we need to do as a church to really grow our missions program and to send people out? I guess is a basic question. Did I say it right, Bert? He's nodding, so I got it right. Any thoughts? I'm going to just toss it open, and then if no one talks, then I'm going to pick someone to talk. Sparky, thank
Always
you.
like to talk. I think, and Pastor Jeff and I have known each other now for several years, and I know that the church here is committed to helping new people that are visiting the church that want to then join the church and be a part of what fellowship is. You have a process of welcoming them into the family, and so as you're teaching them what it means to be a member here, or taking them even if they're newly saved and you're taking them through baptism class, part of introducing them to your church and taking them through that process, talk about missions. If you're meeting during a Sunday school hour and taking your new members through that time, if you're meeting with them at another time, spend one of those sections. This is how we view missions. This is what we believe about missions. This is how we're engaged in missions. This is who our missionaries are. Another thing that you can do is highlight those missionaries during your church service. Just take 2 minutes and say, this Sunday we're talking about Holly and what God's doing with her and where she's at, and here's prayer requests for her. And keep those missionaries before your people where they're seeing them and they're getting to know them, and they will capture the passion of the church for missions if you keep putting that vision out there and the importance of missions. They'll get a hold of it and they'll appreciate it.
Amen. Other questions? You can ask the missionaries anything. Phil. So Phil Thompson's asking, how has missions changed in the last 20 or 30 years, both the face and underlying of that? Dr. McAllister.
Some churches realize that it's hard to turn this around quickly, but if missionaries are just supported at a very minimal level, really small level, and by a large number of churches, that works a hardship on them when they come back on furlough to report to that many churches. Their tongues are hanging out and they need a time of rest. So churches have tried to work toward a larger amount of money and perhaps less missionaries, but that's not the goal, but a larger amount of support. So that's one thing that I think it's an ideal that people have worked toward as they can. I think that, generally speaking, especially in American church planning, and probably to some extent on the mission field, working in teams of people, like the P&G work, is very much a major teamwork. GFA has a large group of missionaries there. Germany, Philippines, certain areas get a strong concentration. I think the intentional indigenization of training national leadership has also taken a much stronger type thing. So Americans realize we're only going to be there for so long. We've got to turn it over quickly. So those are several things I think of.
Yeah. Go ahead, Belinda.
But I guess I can add, GFA has also seen the need to get into many, or the desire to get into many countries that are closed, and so they are starting, or have worked with missionaries who have a skill, who have a business, and they can go into a closed country like Morocco or some other place in the tent, in the window, and go in as having a business, but yet their main goal is making disciples and planning a church. So I think that's something that has changed.
So you're saying more tent maker?
Yes. Right. I forgot that word.
Other questions? Casey.
While you've been on the field, what's the single clearest way that God has ministered to you personally?
So what is the what is the single biggest way on the field that God has ministered to you personally?
There's been times when I've prayed about something and haven't shared it with anybody, and to see him answer it very directly, I think those are some of the most encouraging times for me. It strengthens my faith.
When We had the question about, what was it, the fears, I guess, of being on the field. When I went back as for the second term of my short-term work, I got to Australia, and I really, and I was staying with a mission or a family there for about a week for some reason. I don't remember why, but I really just experienced great fear of what I was entering into. My first, I guess, short term was more comfortable working in the home, homeschooling children and helping the mother so that she could work on language training. And now I was facing the unknown for sure. Me as a physical therapist and was going in to teach people the Bible and to teach people how to read and have kids clubs, and I had no idea, and there was such opposition. And I was ready to get on a plane and just head back to America, and I just had to get in the car and, you know, praise the Lord, I didn't get on the plane. I got in the car and drove up the coast and pulled over and just sat there and cried out to the Lord. And I'm so thankful that He hears, because I still have a stone of remembrance for how He met me and encouraged me. And I'm still there, you know, and I haven't had that fear. I guess, again, He helped me conquer that just by reminding me of the shed blood of Christ and what Christ had done for me. So I just wanted to share that because it just kind of came rushing back. But what was our question? I'm sorry.
That answered it. It's the single biggest time God ministered grace in your heart while on the mission field.
Yeah,
So
well,
that
and
was
then
it.
I guess, and then during my career missions, thank you, I did have a very tumultuous time of hormonal change, and again, I was facing great opposition, but the Lord, in His goodness, again, had provided through a friend, Dr. Jim Berg's Quieting a Noisy Soul, and I decided to start going through that when I was in a very dark time, and that just ministered much grace to me and really helped me become grounded more in who God was. And I have to know who God is if I'm going to be teaching about God. And so that was just a trial that God had for me, so that I could be, I think, more useful to Him on the mission field.
Amen.
For me, in ministry, I would say almost every time that I have been asked to take that next step and do something I've not done before, I had a sense of inadequacy, like, I'm not sure that I can do this. This is the first time I've spoken at a missions conference that I think, as far as speaking for several days at a missions conference. This is the first time I've been on a missions panel. So, Paul said in 2 Corinthians 2, he said, and who is sufficient for these things? Not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything as of ourselves, but our sufficiency is of God. And so God, I think that's what Belinda, her special way of saying all this, is that's how it happened. We can't do anything without God, and especially the things we aren't experienced at. But then He comes through when we trust Him, and it's really, and He grows us through that, and He makes us. He said, part of the answer to that is that He has made us able ministers of the New Testament, 2 Corinthians 3:6. So God is able.
One last question. And we're going to have plenty of time to fellowship. You can stay as late as you want and talk to them individually. So don't worry, Kathy. So if I can repeat it this way, because we've talked about it with other people, so this question I think is common to many in this church. How do I build relationships with a short window or a one-off opportunity? Is part of that question at least? Or how do I minister Christ even in a very short window of opportunity, even though people do seem open because of COVID and everything else?
I know questions are a good thing. Jesus used a lot of questions in his ministry, and sometimes all you have available is to ask a question, and by making an observation, even in your description there, he said you're observing people having a hard time, and in a situation like that, I've found I can go right to the point, and because we're all experiencing the same thing, and I can say, how are you dealing with this? Where are you finding hope today because of what we're all experiencing? And it just immediately, you have a conversation that is pointed the right direction for opportunity with evangelism and developing a relationship potentially too, but leaving them with a question a lot of times.
Sparky, did you have something too?
I think each of us, as called to be a part of the discipleship process, and that begins with evangelism. I think we all need to be prepared to, share something of hope in a short period of time. Now, are you going to sit there and lead somebody to Christ in 30 seconds at the grocery store check stand? No. But you can communicate hope and then follow that up with an invitation or some contact of, hey, if you want to learn more about this, let's get together for coffee. Here's my number. Or, you know what, if you're looking for answers to some of these questions, here's our church, and you can come and we'll meet with you there. Be prepared to invite people. Show them where they can find hope. Share a scripture with them, even if it's just a verse. This is something from the Bible that gives me hope, and point them to the scriptures. And then second of that, as Holly said, then follow up on that relationship. If they're offering to open up and, hey, could we meet at the park, or could we go down and have a coffee somewhere if you can find an open coffee shop somewhere, whatever opportunity there is to pursue that, then we need to be pursuing that. And I agree with Holly that questions were one of Christ's tools. It's also one of our tools. And I'm even finding that people that don't have hope, or they're putting their hope in the wrong thing, asking then a what if question. Well, all of this is just going to go away on November 3rd. Well, what if it doesn't? Where are you going to turn if the election doesn't change things? And that question just sets them back because they haven't thought of that. All of their hope is on November 3rd. Well, what's after November 3rd? I don't know. Hey, if you want to get together and talk about that, I would love to buy you a cup of coffee. And I find a lot of people are open to that, and I've got lots of people that have said, let's get together. And so if you're willing to do that, people are willing to sit down and have those conversations.
I recommend this little gospel booklet called Ultimate Questions by John Blanchard. My wife and I have given these out in our travels. I gave one out yesterday to a young man on the plane that we had a good conversation. I was able to leave it with him. I have never had one person turn me down. I thought I had the guy. I thought I had a guy on a plane recently who's going to say, sorry, I'm not interested. He just didn't seem like the kind of guy to take one of these. And I was not having I hadn't had much sleep the night before, so I was not in a great frame of mind myself, so I had little faith. But he took it, and I guess he kept it. But these are expensive. They're like $3 retail, and you can probably find them on sale for $1 a piece. But it's worthwhile investing. And it's the best presentation of the gospel in print that I know of. And it is thorough. It takes a person all the way back to who is God? How does God speak? What went wrong? It just goes through the whole clear planet, 2 pages, full color. It comes in a smaller booklet form than this as well. But something like that on a short you know, where you don't have long, but say, I want to share this with you. If you give them this, you'll know they have gotten the gospel, at least in print. So something like that, and maybe then follow up and offer to go through the concepts with them.
Praise the Lord. Well, my heart has been greatly blessed, and we've just started, basically. So I'm going to ask Pastor Jeff to come and close us, and there is still plenty more dessert. You need to eat it, because I can't, okay? So I'm just going to leave you with that. Pastor Jeff.
Okay, we're kind of done and kind of not. I wanted to do a few things. I'm going to ask something of the panel. There are a lot of questions that did not get asked just for sake of time. So I'm going to prepare you. I'm going to give a few comments. If you had one last thing to say that you want people to know, these people here, those people that will watch this video later, if you had one thing to say about missions that you wanted them to know, and it's not a sermon, what would that be? So think about that, and we'll come to your answer on that. So if you had one thing that you wanted to say. Okay. A few things. There are comments about a lot of times when you're having a missions conference, you're dealing with and challenging God's people. First of all, you're trying to make people aware of what the need is. And to say it directly, you could ask our panel, are there enough missionaries? Do we have enough missionaries to replace those who are leaving the field? Okay? So therein is your dilemma. And it doesn't matter where they're coming from. I mean, I appreciate the fact that all the missionaries aren't going to come from the United States. But regardless where they come from, this is the philosophy that we drive here. And that is, we can't do it all, but we can do what we can. And we're not responsible for every other church. We're responsible for ourselves. We're not responsible for every other believer. We're responsible for ourselves and what we do with this. But therein is the dilemma. And I'm going to break that out in a little bit different way. And that is, I think, Phil, you asked about the changing face. The changing face is partly right here, but this face is going to change. These people only have so much time that they're going to be on the field by the natural dilemma of humanity. And they have the baton in their hands, just like you have the baton in your hands. And we only have so much time to get done what God has us to get done, but there is a changing face. Brother McAllister has given his life to trying to train young men, and we've even talked about his role and what he's doing now and who's going to take his place. Sparky, the whole role of discipleship. Holly, Belinda, the whole role of discipleship, who's going to take your place? And you addressed it, Sparky, with sustainable ministry beyond you. I'll ask the church family, have you ever heard me talk about when I'm gone? Right. Sometimes when I say that, people will come to me after the service, are you going somewhere? Could be. I could keel over today because of one more piece of pumpkin pie. Praise God. But every church and every individual in that church only has so much time, and we think we have more than we do. And it's gone before we know it. And I'm pleased to say I'm not as old as some of these people up here, but or at least one of these people up here. But we only have so much time, so the changing faces, it's always changing, but that changing face may be yours. Sparky said something, and it's true, and there are a lot of other questions we could ask. We have sometimes the wrong idea of missions, and you don't have to be a preacher to be a missionary. And I think you'd be surprised at what God can do with you if you're just surrendered. I think you'd be surprised at what people do on the field. I think they could give you testimonies of what people are doing on the field that doesn't look, oh, that's what a missionary does? A missionary fixes things? Grings, right? So I wanted to say, as kind of a wrap up, we start by serving here, and I thank the Lord that many of you across this room, as I look at your faces, you're servants here. And you know that part of my burden as our church, and I don't know that you're ever done with it. I don't know that you ever consider yourself good at it. But the burden we have is to equip our people to speak the gospel. Speak the gospel, speak the gospel, speak the gospel. And know that we're the missionary right where we are. So speak the gospel. And to the extent that you don't feel qualified or prepared, let's get there. Let's get there. If we can teach the gospel by getting a stick and writing in the dirt, we can learn it right where we are, right? So I wanted to give one last statement, and I'll come back to if you had one last thing to say. Everybody again talks about fear. And I'm going to tell you very specifically, we've encouraged our children to go on short-term missions. And one of the reasons we've done so is because specifically, I know that it's the roadblock that will prevent my kids' hearts from being open to serving the Lord anywhere. And I'm going to be very specific, but I know it's my family, and you know the scenario. Many of you know that Jonathan grew up with severe allergies to food. I specifically wanted him to go on a mission trip and not live behind the fear of what will happen if I go and this will be the roadblock why I can't go. Did you know he was more healthy in the foreign field than he was in the United States? Everything wasn't infused with dairy and all this other stuff, and he thrived. He thrived. But he learned he didn't have to be afraid. So I'm going to tell you, at least in my life, and I don't know how these folks would say it, but fear is always a part of it. And I don't know that you can say, I'm going to surrender to serve the Lord when I'm not afraid. I'm going to give you a little statement. And forgive me for being a little bit coachy or oomph about it. But I think we need to step on fear with the boot of faith. And we need to squash it like a bug. And it doesn't mean that once you step on it, that the bug's no longer there. It may be squished, but it's still there. You step over it, and you step through it. And what you'll find is that God is bigger than you think. And I'm going to say this. I'm excited about what God's done here at Fellowship, but I'm also, here was my prayer for so many years. Lord, if you'd allow me to start a church, I'd love to be able to be the pastor there and just shepherd that people until I die. And if you could start a church and help us see that happen, Lord, that would be a great thing. I'm going to tell you something. I think my vision was too small. Because God is bigger than one church plant. God is bigger than one. God. It's amazing what God will do. All right. So if you had one last thing to say, we'll just go down the line. Belinda, what would you say? One last thing to say, and you have to use your mic.
Okay. I'm just really burdened for prayer, and that you would pray for your missionaries with knowledge, because you've read their prayer letters over and over again, and you've learned the names of people that they're dealing with and struggles that they have. So praying with knowledge and not being afraid to communicate with a missionary. You know, I'm a single lady. I get lonely. I get really excited when somebody sends me an email. You don't have to send a snail mail. You can send me an email. And it's just a great encouragement to receive notes along the way from people in my supporting churches. You just don't know what a great encouragement that is.
Thank you, Belinda. Holly?
I guess one phrase is, it's worth it. Getting out of my comfort zone, overcoming obstacles. As Pastor said, trusting the Lord to help you overcome fear. It's worth it.
Brother Bruce?
Travel. Go to a mission field. Go cross-cultural. Ask God to help you do it. provide the way, and then go. Go is in the gospel. You got to go. Got to go.
Just want to conclude with saying that missions is not romantic. And I appreciate missionary biographies. I think they've done a lot to push people to consider missions. But sometimes we can read those novels and think, that is just not me. I mean, those people are amazing. They're heroes. They're saints. I mean, a single lady living in Papua New Guinea, going to South Africa, living in the jungles, going from training pastors now to representing a mission board. That's amazing stuff. We could never do that. We can't live like that. And it's not that romantic. It's about faithfulness, just faithfully serving the Lord where He's put us. And as Pastor Jeff said, it might be just fixing somebody's truck that day so that you get an opportunity to invest biblical truth into their life. It might just be getting the lawn mowed and stopping and talking to your neighbor while you happen to be in the middle of Africa. Our life is no different. We're just people. It's not that fantasy kind of dream world to go be a missionary. It's just living life faithfully, representing Jesus Christ where He put us.
Yeah, and you got one shot to get it done. And I don't mean to make that sound so dramatic, but it's kind of like you've got one shot at what your life is going to look like, and opportunities are all around you. They're bigger than we know. And we as a church family, I have to tell you, when we talk about missionaries, I thought about, okay, what if everybody in this room surrendered and left? And not only would that not meet the need of missions across the world, but the thing is, we're trusting the Lord right here for what He's got for us to do, and knowing that missions is right where we are. So we just need God's help to be the church that we're supposed to be, and be the individual that we're supposed to be, and we'll trust God for what He's going to do. And I want to thank everybody online for joining us. I want to thank everybody that's taking the time to be here today.